This morning's title is Paul Appeals to Caesar. And the text comes from Acts chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. So I'd like to read those verses so they're fresh in our minds. So Acts chapter 25, verse 1. Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul. And they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept in Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man, to see if there is any fault in him. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. So as we finished looking at Acts chapter 24, we saw the decisions that were made by Felix. Remember, Felix's immediate decision, his first decision was to put off making a decision on Paul's legal case. Remember, Felix had adjourned the proceedings, and he said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision on your case. Remember, we saw that was just a stalling tactic. And he commanded that the centurion keep Paul and let him have liberty or freedom, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide or visit for him. So what he tried to do was make both sides happy. He appeased the Jews by keeping Paul in custody, but he also treated Paul with the respect that he was due as a Roman citizen, as his friends were allowed to minister to him. And remember, in the Greek, it literally meant to wait on him as servants. So they would come in and minister to his personal needs, his physical needs, but in the meantime, he was ministering to them in their spiritual needs. And then we saw his second decision was to put off making a decision for the gospel. We're told in Acts chapter 24, verses 24 and 25, it says, after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he, Paul, reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. We saw that Paul presented the gospel to Felix. He talked to Felix about the righteousness demanded by a holy God. And he talked to him about man's lack of self-control, right? His propensity to sin. And then he wrapped it up as he talked about the judgment to come. And we see the reaction by Felix. It says he was afraid. It's more than afraid. Literally, Felix was terrified. Because some of your translations will actually say that he trembled. So as conviction gripped his heart, he could not hide it. He was physically trembling, shaking with fear. But then we saw that his fear did not lead him to repentance. Because his decision was to go away, Paul. Paul, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I'll call you to myself. What he said was, thanks, but no thanks, Paul. Not right now. Really making that decision, I'm not going to surrender. I'm not going to surrender my heart to Christ. Basically telling him, hurry and get out of my sight. And he says, I'll call you back when the time's convenient for me. It was another way of saying, you know what, I'll come to God on my terms. Remember, we studied and we looked at that. When is that ever going to happen? It won't. Because all men come to God on His terms. So then he made his final decision, and that was to look out for himself and really please man rather than God. Because remember, he had hoped that Paul would give him a bribe. So he kept calling him from here and there, hoping that Paul would get the hint. Give me a little cash and I'll let you go. But Paul would not do that. He did not give in. And we're told in verse 27 that after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So we see that going back and forth, calling him to try to get a bribe, lasted 2 years, 2 whole years. The Jews, though, had become so angry with Felix because he had treated the Jews in Caesarea when they rioted so harshly that they lobbied to have Felix removed as governor, so he was removed. But on his way out the door, he wanted to leave on a high note with the Jews, so he left Paul in custody. And that's really where we're at in our text today, where our text picks up. Paul has been in custody in Caesarea for 2 years. And now there's a new governor. His name's Festus. I know, those of you who used to watch Gunsmoke, that's not him. I know who's old in here now. But Festus. Now Festus has to make a decision. And we're going to see a word that came up in that last verse. It's that word called a favor. A favor. So when you do someone a favor, it's really putting them in debt to you. Right? You owe me one is kind of the way that they look at that. But you know what else a favor is? It's a travesty of justice. Justice does not do favors. Justice follows the law, follows the truth. So we're going to see that Festus needs to make some decisions. And we'll also see that Paul does not agree with the way Festus wants to handle this whole situation. And he ends up appealing to Caesar. So 4 areas I want to look at today as we go through the text. I want to look at the priest's request, Festus's refusal, Festus's dilemma, and finally Paul's decision. So the priest's request, Festus's refusal, Festus's dilemma, and Paul's decision. So let's look at the priest's request in verses 1 through 3. It says, Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. See, when Festus took over as governor of the province of Judea, he inherited a mess. there were many political problems that were left behind by Felix. And most of them came about because of his cruel and his callous treatment of the Jews. And that left the Jewish people hating Rome. See, Festus would have known why Felix was removed from office, why he was going there to be governor. He would have known that he was removed because Felix was inept and he had harsh treatment of the Jews. And he would have been told, as he was leaving to take over as governor, make sure you don't make the same mistakes that Felix did. So we see that he moved quickly to soothe the tension in the region. Right? Verse 1, it says, "Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem." See, he was only in Judea for 3 days. If you think about it, he just took a long boat ride to get there, would have landed in Caesarea, would have unpacked all of his stuff from the ship, brought it up to the governor's mansion, unpacked, and then he would have left right away. 3 days. And it says that he went up to Jerusalem. Again, went up because elevation-wise, Jerusalem was the highest. And you see that his first goal as governor was to meet with the Jewish leaders. See, Festus knew that the key to keep peace in Judea was to get on the good side of the Jewish religious leaders. See, peace was the number one goal of all Roman governors. But Festus also knew that he had to be on guard when talking to these leaders. See, these leaders were skilled in manipulation. See, they did it to Pilate, basically blackmailing him to kill Jesus. And even though they did not get Felix to execute Paul, they were able to have him kept in confinement for over 2 years, meaning that he was not able to go out and spread the gospel. So we see Festus really inherited a political problem, but he also inherited a prisoner problem. And the Jewish leaders did not forget about Paul. Look at verse 2. It says, "Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him." So the high priest, it's Ananias, along with the rest of the Sanhedrin, now tried to seize the opportunity to bring up Paul's case and hopefully get Festus to do what Felix wouldn't do. See, they would have known that Festus wanted to be on their good side, because they would have known that he knew the tensions were bad. But also they would have known that when new governors would come in and take over a province, they usually dismissed the cases that were left from the previous governor. So they wanted to hurry up and act quickly. See, they want to move before Festus understands what's really going on here and finds out who Paul really is. So it says they asked a favor of him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem. Right? So the Sanhedrin asking Festus to do them a favor. Hey, you want to get on our good sides here? Here's what you can do. Send Paul. Have him come up to Jerusalem. So they wanted Paul brought to Jerusalem to stand trial. And basically telling Festus, guess what? You do that, you'll be free of Paul. You won't have to worry about what was left behind. And besides, you do us a favor, we'll be in your debt. We'll owe you a favor. So they're trying to get Festus to think about how much goodwill this gesture would give. then Luke really gives us the reason why they asked. Right? While they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. We see that they go back to their bag of tricks, the old ambush plot. Right? Remember 2 years earlier. Turn back to Acts chapter 23. Let's look at how that plot came about. Acts chapter 23, look at verses 12 through 15. It says, "And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were no more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near.'" Right? So these zealots, 40 zealots, come up with this plan, make an oath. We're not going to eat or drink anything till we kill Paul. But Sanhedrin, we need your help. You need to go tell Lysias, the commander, to send him to your chambers tomorrow. And before he gets here, we'll overpower him and we'll kill him. End of Paul. Remember then Paul's nephew overheard? And he went to Paul. And then Paul had him brought to the commander. And the nephew told the commander of the plot. And the commander sent Paul with 470 soldiers by cover of night out of Jerusalem. Right? And that is how Paul has now ended up here in Caesarea. So that first plot wasn't even the Sanhedrin's idea, was it? It was guys that came to them and then they became complicit in it. Now this time, 2 years later, it's their plot. It's their idea. So now they want Paul brought back so that they can ambush and kill him. I bet you this is not the same crew that took the oath the first time. I don't know if they lasted 2 years without food. Either that or they broke their oath, right? But really what it does is it shows the hatred that the Sanhedrin had for Paul and for Christians. It was still burning 2 years later. But really, they stood against anyone. Anyone who threatened their hold on the people. Anyone who threatened their power, who threatened their prestige, threatened their livelihood. Anybody that threatened them had to be taken out and killed. That's what they thought. See, it was the same in the time of Jesus, wasn't it? When he stood up against them, what did they want to do? Kill him. They were successful. But the more Jesus spoke out against them, they became more enraged. And now we see it continue on in these men years later. So these men were no different than the men at the time of Jesus. If you could find your way to Matthew chapter 23. Because Jesus in Matthew 23 had become known as the 8 woes. So Matthew chapter 23, verse 13. Jesus said, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Verse 14, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make longer prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold in the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Skip down to verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! In verse 25, you hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but the inside are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead man's bones and all uncleanness. Now look at verses 29 and 30. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. These 8 woes, exposing what they truly were and what their motives were as the leaders. What they were out for was themselves, not for God. Right? They were drawing disciples unto themselves, not unto God. Right? They were all about the deeds, the outward appearances, not the heart. There was no justice and mercy and faith, he said. Really, the biggest indictment he had was that they were leading people away from God, not towards Him. The same is true about the Sanhedrin here in Acts chapter 25. They were doing the same. See, and Jesus and Matthew would go on to tell of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And at this point in Acts chapter 25, it's only 10 years away. It's getting closer. So the Sanhedrin, they want Festus to call for Paul to be brought to Jerusalem so that they can ambush and kill him on the way. But next we see Festus's refusal in verses 4 and 5. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. So Festus, even though he was only on the job for about 3 days, he must have known about Paul, his prisoner. See, he would have known that Paul was a Roman citizen, because that's why he was in custody in the governor's mansion. See, he would have known that there was something unique about Paul's case. There's something unique about it, because why was this man still under house arrest after 2 years? And he knew that he could not send Paul back to a non-Roman court, right? To the Jewish Sanhedrin. He couldn't do that because Paul's case was already heard in a Roman court. And another thing is, he probably didn't see the point of waiting while he sent a messenger to Caesarea a couple days, and then have him come back a few more days when he himself was only going to be there a little while longer. Just one commentator pointed out, and the accommodations that he would have had in Jerusalem are nowhere near what he had when he would have been in Caesarea. He's probably thinking this trip to Jerusalem is just a necessary evil. I got to get back. So Festus's decision was that Paul would stay in Caesarea because he's going to be returning there shortly. So what he was really saying is Paul will remain in Caesarea and continue to be tried in a Roman court. Since the proper thing is for him as a Roman citizen is to be tried in that Roman court. In verse 5 he says, "Therefore, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault with him." So what he says to them is, if you want me to hear your case against Paul, then send the men who have the authority to make the charges against him. And then come back with me when I return, and then we'll have a hearing. Right? Then they can make their accusations against Paul, and then I'll render my verdict. So what we see again is Paul being protected by God. Right? He's being protected again by the plot now of the Sanhedrin to murder him. And this time, God uses Festus to say that Paul is going to stay in Caesarea and that you guys, you Sanhedrin, you can send your accusers to return with me. So he denies their request. And now we're going to see Festus's dilemma in verses 6 through 9. It says, "And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So we see right away that shortly, when he said, I'm going to return shortly, turned out to be a little while. It says, and when he had remained among them more than 10 days. Other translations say after he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days. So we would say that he stayed about a week and a half more in Jerusalem. And then he left to return to Caesarea. And then we see that he was a man of his word. In verse 6 it says, And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. So what we see now is Festus officially convenes a trial. So he's sitting on the judgment seat, and he calls in Paul. So now he's the judge. The prosecution came with him. Now he's calling in the defense. We're going to have another trial. So the prosecutors go first. Verse 7, when Paul had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul. So we see here, and we're told that they laid many serious complaints against Paul. Or other translations word it this way, they brought many and serious charges against him. Brought many and serious charges. See, what were these serious charges? Well, these serious charges would have been the same. The same that they had Tertullus bring against Paul in the trial before Felix. And what were those charges? Let's look back to Acts 24, verses 5 and 6. The charges were, "For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law." So the charges presented by Tertullus, remember those were classified in 3 different areas. They were personal, political, and doctrinal. Right? That personal charge that we found this man to be a plague, or a real pest, or a troublemaker. Right? What they're saying is this man is a public nuisance. He's a plague to society. And the point they were trying to make is that Paul infects the people with his teachings. Then they offered that political charge, right? He's a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And this was that most serious charge as it concerned Roman law. Right? The Romans, remember, they took pride in their peace, Roman peace, Pax Romana they called it. So Paul now is accused of upsetting that peace. He's accused of sedition or insurrection or rebellion against the Roman Empire. And he says not only does Paul create dissension, he's the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, those that are going about shaking up the whole world. Remember that word ringleader? That was that military term. That term for the one who stands in the front rank, the one who leads them in the battle. And that Nazarenes, that was that derisive term used of the followers of Jesus. Right? There was that personal charge, a political charge, and then that doctrinal charge. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. See, these were serious charges that they were bringing against Paul. And Luke tells us at the end of verse 7 in Acts 25, these were serious charges which they could not prove. In the 2 years since they brought the same charges against Paul before Felix, in the 2 years, they still have not found any witnesses or were able to get any evidence to substantiate their case. I watched some Law and Order substantiate their case. But you see that 2 years, it's the same thing. There are no real charges. There's no evidence. There's no eyewitnesses. It's just charges. We see in verse 8, it's time for the defense to speak. Well, Paul answered for himself, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." See, Paul denies point by point, doesn't he? Those 3 areas that he was charged against. He's saying, I'm not guilty of any charges, whether it be personal, political, or religious. I'm not guilty of any of them. See, now Festus is at the same place. He's in the same place that Felix was 2 years earlier. Right? Felix has the same and faces the same dilemma. Paul's a Roman citizen, falsely accused and obviously innocent. But if he were to let him go, that would anger the Sanhedrin. Right? They are the people that Festus has to keep happy to keep the peace. Right? That dilemma again. Do I stick with the law? Or do I try to keep people happy? Do I stick with the truth? Or do I compromise and try to keep people happy so that they're not mad at me and I don't lose my job as governor? Right? He's thinking all of this. That same dilemma. It says in verse 9, but Festus wanting to do the Jews a favor. So we see that unlike Felix, who decides to do nothing, Festus decides to try and do something, but that something is that he wants to compromise. He wants to do the Jews a favor. And really what he wants to do is give them what they wanted in the first place. So he asked Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried before me concerning these things? Basically what he's saying here is, I'll leave it up to Paul and see if he wants to go back to Jerusalem and finish the trial there. That way, if he picks to go back and something happens, Paul wanted to go there. It wasn't me. But if he says no, well, I can't do it because he has rights, and see? So what is he doing? He's really choosing to make no decision again. He's trying to put the decision onto Paul. See, the dilemma of Festus ends with a question. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So let's close now by looking at Paul's decision. In verses 10 through 12. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. See, Paul is a very smart man. He could tell that Festus wanted to abandon him. Festus wanted to abandon Paul and give him to the Jews. Right? He wanted to give him over, have a trial up in Jerusalem, where they would have been the majority. See, Paul knows that if he would have agreed to go up to Jerusalem, it was going to be a sham trial anyway. If he even made it that far. See, the trial, he knows, if he went there, would certainly end in his death. If he made it that far. Either way, the Jerusalem route, Paul's looking at it going, that's death either way. So what does Paul do? He rejects Festus' attempt to wash his hands of the situation. See, Festus, as governor of Judea, served as Caesar's representative in that area. And he was to rule and judge with the authority of Caesar. So that's why Paul says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. So basically what he's saying is, I'm being tried in a Roman court, and as a Roman citizen, that is where I should be judged. And by invoking Caesar's name, you notice this is the third time he's done that? Why does he keep saying Caesar? Well, he's doing that to remind Festus who he answers to. See, and Paul says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. This is where I need to be judged. And then again, he states his innocence against the charges brought by the Sanhedrin. To the Jews I have done no wrong. And then he adds, as you very well know. Festus, you know this. You know I'm not guilty of what they're charging me of. You know there's no witnesses. There's no case here. And then what Paul does next is he sets Festus straight. He says in verse 11, For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. Basically what he's saying is if I'm guilty, if I were guilty, I would stand here and take my punishment. And then he adds in verse 11, But if there is anything in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. So if there's nothing in these things, right? Paul is saying that as a Roman citizen, he has to be tried in a Roman court. And since the Jews have no case against him, there is no way anyone, including Festus, can turn him over to them. And he says, I am not going to agree to that. See, Paul, we would look at this and say, Paul is in a no-win situation right now. Think about it. I watched a few game shows when I was a kid. He's on Let's Make a Deal. Some of you guys watch that too? What's behind door number one? Behind door number one is Festus is not going to rule because he wants to do the Jews a favor and be on their good side. That's door number one. Door number two, agree to go up to Jerusalem. And he surely will die. So what does Paul do? He says, I pick door number 3. I appeal to Caesar. Checkmate. You're trying to get me to do these two things, I'm going to do this. And now again, he evokes his rights as a Roman citizen. It was his invoking of his rights as a Roman citizen that got him to Caesarea. And now, the further invoking of his rights is going to get him to Rome. See, as a Roman citizen, he had a right to appeal to Caesar at any time during his legal proceedings. Not like us, you only get to appeal to a higher court after a verdict is reached. In Roman law, any time during proceedings, you could appeal to Caesar. And with that appeal, by appealing to Caesar, what that does is it takes the case immediately out of Festus's hands. And Festus then had to abide by this appeal to Caesar, and he could not interfere with it. See, this appeal by Paul shows Paul's confidence actually in true Roman justice, in the Roman justice system. And really, he was thinking about the fairness of the emperor. The emperor at this time was Nero, and Nero is the one that killed many Christians. But at this time, it was early on in his reign before he turned against Christians. But he knows by going to the emperor, at least he's going to get a fair shake, because then the Jewish leaders aren't going to be able to influence him. And that shouldn't have any bearing on the decision. He knows that the emperor would rule based on law. It says in verse 12, Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, You have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So that basically he seeks legal advice to those around him, like, oh, what am I supposed to do here? Well, then they decide and they declare that since Paul appealed to Caesar, he was going to send him to Caesar. When those words came out of Festus's mouth, what do you think Paul's reaction was? Probably one of joy, one of gladness. Not because he saved his life, but because now he knew he was going to be sent to where he wanted to go. And he would have had delight in his heart because now he knows that the Lord is keeping his promise. Acts chapter 23, verse 11. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul. For as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." See, Paul was resting on this promise. And I'm sure that promise was in the back of his head as he's trying to think, what door do I pick? Right? See, Paul is going to be sent to Rome because that's where Caesar is. But he's not going to go right away. He's going to have to endure quite a few things on the way there. It's not going to be an easy trip. But what do we take away from this? I hope we can take away and be encouraged by Paul. By Paul. Why? Because he stood for the truth. He stood for justice. But he also trusted in the promises of God. And trusting in the promises of God means that you know that God is sovereign, that He is in control. And when God says something, it will happen. Is it going to be easy? No. But he has hope. He knows that God's word is true. May we also be encouraged by His word and the promises we have in it.